A dusty manuscript opens to a verse that reads like instructions for a flying machine. Across cultures, old myths that hint at lost technologies sometimes encode real skills, forgotten inventions, or poetic exaggerations of ancient craft. This tour blends history, archaeology, and speculative detective work while staying grounded in sources, dramatic anecdotes, and visuals that help you judge for yourself. By the end, you will be able to rank the top 3 most convincing cases and explain why some legends deserve serious archaeological attention. Each segment will introduce a myth, lay out the technological clue it suggests, present evidence for and against, show visuals you can picture on screen, and end with a cliffhanger that keeps the curiosity alive. We will wrestle with whether a bronze giant once patrolled Crete and whether a famous relic could have stored electrical energy. Which myth do you think actually hides a lost technology? One passage reads like a flight log. Ancient Sanskrit epics name a craft called Pushpaka that descends from the heavens, moves with the will of its rider, and carries kings across continents. The Ramayana paints scenes of a flying palace that returns to the sky at sunset and lands as gently as a cloud. The Mahabharata describes aerial battles with vehicles that rise and fall like storms and release shafts of light and fire. Some verses list parts that sound surprisingly specific. Passages refer to rudders to steer, to materials used in construction, and to substances that act like fuels. Later technical works attributed to temple architects and inventors describe devices and propulsion systems, sometimes using mercury and other exotic materials. That is where the line between myth and manual becomes slippery. Scholarship is layered and messy. Tradition credits the Ramayana to sage Valmiki and the Mahabharata to sage Vyasa. Historians point out that both epics grew over long oral histories with additions and redactions over centuries. Oral layers could be many thousands of years old, while the texts we read today were fixed much later. Enthusiasts who study ancient aeronautics read those layers as evidence of real machines and sometimes publish detailed reconstructions of cabins, engines, and control surfaces. Skeptical scholars push back hard. They note that poetic language compresses images and that words translated as engines or fuel may have originally been metaphors for divine power or speed. They also warn that later medieval manuals could reflect medieval imagination projected onto older stories. Examples help show both sides. A line that many point to describes a craft that soars at the speed of thought and obeys its master. Taken literally, that reads like an autopilot. Taken as poetry, it is a divine vehicle that answers prayer. Technical manuals attributed to later centuries go further and sketch diagrams and materials. Archaeologists ask for physical remains and clear stratified evidence before calling these mythic descriptions proof of lost technologies. Translators add another complication. Sanskrit words often carry several meanings, and ancient meters favor compact phrasing, so a single word might be read as a literal part or as an image. On screen, these possibilities become striking. Animated reconstructions can show a pushpaka fitted out like a modern passenger cabin or rendered as a luminous palace floating on clouds. Side-by-side cutaways of contemporary aircraft engines make the comparison visceral. High-resolution manuscript images show scribes drawing curving lines that some read as plans. Map overlays tracing trade routes from the Indian subcontinent across the Indian Ocean suggest how ideas or motifs could travel and transform. Sound design can emphasize thunderous engines or chanting bards to remind viewers of the choice between literal and lyrical readings. So, which is more likely, a lost technology or poetic fancy? Could ritual language be encoding practical engineering knowledge in layers of metaphor? Could later technical treatises preserve a tradition of practical craft that earlier epics wrapped in myth? The mystery hangs between a lover of machinery and a lover of story, and it pulls us toward the question of what we accept as evidence for ancient invention. One relic in particular reads like a manual for danger. The Ark of the Covenant is described in sacred texts as a gilded chest overlaid with gold, flanked by 2 carved cherubim, and crowned by a mercy seat where a presence appears like a flame or a bright cloud. The narratives place the Ark at the heart of the tabernacle rituals that ancient priests guarded with strict rules about who could approach, how, and when. Several episodes stand out for their violence and mystery. When worshippers moved the Ark improperly, a man named Uzzah reached out to steady it and was struck down. During battles, the Philistines captured the Ark but returned it after plagues and frightening tumors afflicted their cities. When priests carried the Ark on a cart, a great crash of noise and terror followed, and the Ark is said to have opened graves and toppled idolatry with terrifying force. The language used in these passages often mixes sensory details like light and sound with moral outrage, leaving the modern reader to wonder whether the descriptions mask an experience that was physical as well as spiritual. Textual and archaeological context matters when parsing those stories. The core traditions about the tabernacle and the Ark are rooted in long oral histories that scholars often place in the late 2nd millennium before the Common Era, though the written forms we read were shaped and edited in centuries that followed. Temple narratives where the Ark plays a central role take shape around the time connected in tradition with Solomon and the first temple in the 10th century before the Common Era. Later Jewish and Christian commentators add layers of memory and legend. By the time of the Babylonian conquest, many centuries later accounts suggest the Ark disappeared or was hidden away to protect it from conquerors. Different traditions then diverge. Some Jewish sources hint that the Ark was concealed within sacred precincts, while other streams of tradition and some medieval accounts point eastward to Ethiopia, where a long-held local claim says the Ark rests in a church in the city of Axum. These competing stories feed the mystery and complicate any straightforward reading of the text as a report of technology. That complication is where speculative ideas flourish. A number of modern writers and experimenters have wondered whether the Ark could have been more than a symbolic throne for a deity. One technology hypothesis treats the Ark as a kind of ancient electrical device or storage vessel. The argument rests on a few key building blocks. First, the Ark is described as metal-plated and structurally strong enough to be carried on poles. Second, the accounts emphasize visible phenomena that resemble light or sparks and physical effects felt at a distance. Third, later antiquity offers examples of human-made devices that generate electricity from simple components. The most famous archaeological analog is the Baghdad battery, discovered in the 1930s near modern Baghdad. Those cylindrical objects consist of a clay pot, a copper tube, and an iron rod, and have been interpreted by some as galvanic cells that could produce a small electric current when filled with an acidic liquid. Experiments with recreated Baghdad batteries demonstrate a modest voltage enough to plate metal in controlled setups. That makes the idea of ancient people understanding basic chemical electricity less implausible than it might seem at first. Translating that plausibility to the Ark raises immediate questions. A galvanic cell produces low voltages and requires maintenance and fluids. To build a power source at the scale that could cause visible sparks or lethal shocks, something far more elaborate would be needed. Some speculative models suggest the Ark could have housed jars or devices that, when combined, produced larger effects, or that it contained conductive elements that amplified electrostatic discharges. Others propose acoustic or pneumatic mechanisms built into the chest that produced terrifying sounds or pressure waves when mishandled. Practical issues are stubborn. The cultural context of ancient Israel did include skilled metalworking, sacred gold, and elaborate ritual craft, but there is no clear archaeological trace of deliberately engineered electrical devices from that society. The Ark itself was tightly controlled by ritual law, and its construction was described in terms that emphasize holiness and symbolism rather than mechanical function. That makes the leap from sacred container to power system risky. There are also simpler, less technological explanations that fit the texts and the world behind them. The imagery of light and sound may be theological language describing the felt presence of the sacred. Stories of death for touching the ark reinforce social rules about ritual purity and authority. Tales of violent physical effects can also be narrative devices that explain victories and defeats in moral as well as military terms. And oral transmission can magnify single sensations into dramatic divine interventions across generations. On screen, the contrast between these possibilities is striking. A slow pan over an artist reconstruction of a gold-plated chest, overlaid with pulsing light and rumbling sound, sells the idea of a charged relic. Cut to footage of replicated Baghdad battery experiments and a small arc of electricity from a simple cell, and the audience can see the mechanical limit of those devices. A cautious caption warns that imagination fills gaps where evidence does not reach, and archival images of textual passages remind viewers that interpretation carries weight and bias. Was the ark a sacred metaphor made vivid by ritual language, a ceremonial object whose symbolic power felt like real force, or an engineered device misunderstood by later storytellers and priests? The answer shapes how we read ancient accounts of the miraculous and how we draw the line between myth and lost technology. Which explanation holds the most weight depends on whether you trust the words as witness or as crafted story, and whether you expect the archaeological record to reveal machines designed to mimic the voice of gods. Plato painted Atlantis as a ringed metropolis of canals and gleaming metal. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he tells a layered tale of an island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, rich in harbors, gardens, and vast engineering works. The story describes concentric rings of water and land cut by broad canals, a central hill crowned with palaces and temples, and roads and bridges that knit the city together. Plato claims that these events occurred 9,000 years before Solon, and that the island fell under the wrath of the gods and sank in a single night and day of violent earthquakes and floods. The language is precise in places, oddly architectural in others, with named features, measurements, and lists of materials that push the account beyond casual myth into the territory of technical description. One detail that keeps historians and dreamers arguing is a metal called orichalcum, said to gleam like red gold and used to line temples and important chambers. Modern scholars have suggested that orichalcum might be a form of bronze or brass, an alloy with a distinct reddish shine, though definitive proof remains elusive. The physical details in the dialogues feed a tempting interpretation. The ringed canals sound like advanced hydraulic engineering. The city layout implies sophisticated urban planning and monumental stonework. The emphasis on mines, foundries, and metal ornamentation reads like a civilization with advanced metallurgy. At the same time, the wider context of Plato matters. He was writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, and his dialogues are philosophical tools. Many readers argue that he used the Atlantis story to illustrate political ideas about virtue and corruption, and to dramatize the fate of a state that grew arrogant. Other scholars point to memory and trauma instead of invention. They note that stories travel and transform, and that the cataclysmic eruption on the island of Thera and the collapse of Minoan centers in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era could have left echoes that reached Greek storytellers. That would explain parallels between Plato's descriptions and actual Bronze Age cities that featured complex plumbing, paved courts, and skilled artisans like the palaces on Crete. Archaeology adds texture without settling the debate. Excavations at Minoan sites reveal advanced stone masonry, elaborate drainage systems, and maritime trade networks, all things that resonate with Plato's picture. On the other hand, the geological and chronological gaps are large, and nothing excavated so far matches the scale of Plato's concentric ring city. That is where imagination fills the gaps and different theories take hold. Some modern explorers point to the Richat structure in Mauritania, a bullseye of eroded rings visible from space as a candidate because its concentric form looks like Plato's design. Others favor submerged areas near Santorini or islands lost to rising seas, or simply see Atlantis as a moral allegory. On screen, the debate becomes irresistible. CGI reconstructions can render a ringed city with polished metal facades and busy canals, while maps pin proposed locations from the Aegean to the Atlantic. Side-by-side footage of Minoan palaces with their frescoed courts and engineered plumbing lets viewers judge how close real Bronze Age centers come to Plato's account. A recreated close-up of orichalcum tiles catching sunlight drives home why listeners long for a material explanation, and yet the deeper mystery remains. If Plato intended to teach a philosophical lesson, why did he give the tale such precise technical color? If he borrowed from memory of real places, how did so many distinct archaeological discoveries later seem to line up with the story? The answer sits somewhere between invention and memory, and the pull of those shining rings keeps the question alive. A bronze giant circled an island and hurled stones at ships. The island in the story is Crete, and the giant is Tolos, a guardian made of bronze who walked the shore 3 times each day to keep strangers away. The tale appears in Greek storytelling, woven by poets and mythographers, and it lands in poems that sailors and city listeners passed along as both marvel and warning. Tolos is sometimes said to be the creation of a forge god, sometimes a gift from a master craftsman, and sometimes an animating miracle born of bronze and cunning. That mixture of metalwork and myth is what makes the story feel less like a simple fable and more like a memory blurred by time. The Bronze Age Aegean was full of skilled metalworkers. Workshops in palaces and coastal towns produced weapons, votive figures, and ornate vessels. Large hollow bronzes survive from later periods, testifying to casting techniques that could make statues both light and durable. A pair of freestanding bronzes recovered from the sea show joins and internal cavities that prove ancient craftsmen understood how to shape and move heavy metal with precision. Those finds make it worth asking whether a legend about a moving bronze could be a distorted echo of real mechanical achievement. Ancient descriptions of Tolos add odd technical details that stubbornly resist pure allegory. One version says the giant had a single vein of ichor like a blood vessel, and that it was sealed by a single nail. When the nail was removed, the ichor flowed out and Tolos died. Taken as pure poetry, the line sounds like mortal melodrama and divine biology. Read as technology, the same image suggests a sealed conduit or plug that controlled a working fluid, a maintenance port that when opened would drain pressure or power. Engineers of later ages built devices with single plugs to drain water from bellows and to release pressure from boilers. The mythic nail might be a figuration of an access point that anyone who tinkers with machines would recognize. That possibility opens other technical threads. Moving a full-sized bronze figure would not be magic so much as clever engineering. Simple gearing and pulleys can transform a slow spool of rope into rhythmic limb movement. Counterweights hidden in a bronze torso can return an arm to its rest after a shove. Water-driven systems can drive rotation and timing, and Hellenic engineers in later centuries created temple automata that opened doors and poured libations using hidden siphons and cleverly routed air. The leap from those temple spectacles to a coastal sentinel is not trivial, but it is less impossible than ancient audiences might have thought. Another reading casts Tolos as a metaphor for coastal defenses that looked supernatural to attackers. A statue on the headland could hide a ballista or a sling operated by ropes, or it could mark the location of a concealed crew who released rocks from a crane or dropped heavy weights onto invaders. A chain across a harbor can stop a ship and seem to be controlled by a single point of human or mechanical effort. So the giant could be an exaggerated report of a real defensive system that frightened sailors into believing the island had a bronze guardian. Visual storytelling makes those possibilities visceral. and animated tolos can creak and glow, bolts and gears revealed within a chest when a nail is drawn. Cutaways to archaeological bronzes and workshop tools show how lost wax casting and riveting work together. Simple diagrams demonstrate how a hidden capstan and a winch can make a stone fly, and how a single drain plug can disable a hydraulic circuit. Sound design can make the bronze footsteps thunder and then silence fall when a single nail is loosened. Yet caution matters. Myths operate at the boundary of belief and invention. Tolos can be a symbol of protection and divine favor as much as a memory of machines. The poetic image of Ica and a fatal nail reinforces ideas about life, mortality, and the limits of human control. Without a wrecked automaton to examine, the argument rests on analogy and plausibility rather than a smoking relic. So when sailors tell of a bronze giant and poets give it a nail for a heart, are they describing an actual mechanical marvel that later engineers would echo, or are they crafting a powerful symbol from the technologies and fears of their age? Which side of that choice do you find more convincing, the machine or the metaphor Hephaestus' forge smelled of smoke and moving metal? Homer paints a workshop where hammers beat and golden handmaidens move at the god's command, helping him tend the bellows and bring out bright armor for the heroes. Hesiod gives the maker god a long catalogue of cunning works and gifts given to gods and mortals, a register of craft so detailed it reads like a smithy inventory. Those lines do more than flatter a deity. They string together recurring images of bronze shaped into life, of crafted parts that join and repeat a motion, and of devices that behave as if someone wound them from within. The stories name self-moving tables that glide across halls, animated tripods that wheel about to serve, and mechanical maidens who pour wine and keep the hearth. In myth, these marvels are gifts from a master artisan, wonders meant to show divine generosity and human skill. Behind those wonders lay real workshops where artisans cast, hammered, riveted, and polished metal until it held edge and form. Archaeologists and metalworkers studying Hellenic bronzes point to techniques that make movement possible. Found hollow cast statues and complex joints prove ancient makers knew how to shape large metal shells without filling them with lead. They used molds and core supports to form cavities and to join parts with pins and rivets so a limb could pivot. They understood counterweights that returned an arm to rest and balances that timed motion. That technical vocabulary turns up again in later Hellenistic and early Roman manuals. Engineers and writers like Philon of Byzantium and Hero of Alexandria record devices that sound uncannily like the automata of myth. Hero describes temple doors that open on their own when a fire is lit at the altar, mechanisms driven by changing air pressure and clever siphons. He builds whistles and organs that play with steam, puppets that move when water fills hidden chambers, and timing systems that release weights at set intervals. Those are not fairy tales, they are step-by-step designs, complete with tubes, valves, and explanations of cause and effect. On a practical level, those systems are relatives of modern automation. They use feedback loops where pressure or weight triggers a change that then resets the mechanism, the same basic idea behind simple control systems in later centuries. Archaeological finds add weight to the argument that Greek technical skill could have birthed mythic machines. The Antikythera mechanism recovered from a shipwreck is a famous example. Its dense cluster of interlocking gears calculates astronomical cycles in ways that would challenge craftsmen from much later times. Small bronze chariots, toys, and miniature wheeled models found in graves show careful gear teeth and axles, tiny laboratories of mechanics that could plausibly teach principles applied at larger scale. Temple theaters provide another clue. Stagecraft demanded moving scenery lowering gods from the sky and rolling platforms that revealed mystery plays. The very word used by playwrights for a crane literally evokes machine. When audiences gasped at a god appearing through the roof, they were witnessing engineered effects built from ropes, pulleys, capstans, and counterweights. On screen, these threads are dramatic. A reenactment can show workshop smoke curling as apprentices lift a hollow bronze torso onto a stand while a master fits a pivot at the hip. Cut to an ancient stage as a god descends on a lattice of ropes and a hidden winch groans into motion. Overlay Hero of Alexandria diagrams as animated cutaways, tubes filling with air and moving tiny figures in sync with a temple ritual. Close-ups of miniature chariots and gear teeth make the mechanics human scale so viewers feel how a craftsman might have moved from toy to temple automaton. The tricky question is whether myth preserves lost how toss or whether engineers later translated theatrical spectacle into dry diagrams that only look like echoes. Did poets borrow the language of workshops to dress moral lessons in metal? Or did technical expertise seep into stories because those devices really existed and surprised the common eye? The trail runs from Hesiod and Homer through Hellenistic inventors and on to mechanical treatises that survive in fragments. Could Hephaestus' living workshop be a memory smoothed into myth of once ordinary machines and rituals that now seem miraculous? Or did later engineers write down clever tricks that earlier storytellers only dreamed about? A rusted gear changed how we imagined ancient engineers. Sponge divers pulled the first fragments from a shipwreck off an island, and everything that followed felt like peeling back a secret. The pieces came up in 1901, tangled with pottery and glass from a vessel wrecked in the sea. The wreck and its finds placed the object in the 1st century before the Common Era, and subsequent metallurgical study and radiocarbon dating of associated materials confirmed it belongs to the late Hellenistic world. At first, the recovered bronze looked like ordinary corroded plates and a few gilt fragments. Then scholars noticed teeth along a rim and tiny gear segments under incrustation. Those teeth opened the door to a different story. Advanced imaging changed the mystery into a machine. Computed tomography scans and high-resolution X-ray photography taken decades later revealed multiple layers of precisely cut gears hidden inside corroded blocks. Researchers counted more than 30 interlocking gears arranged in calibrated trains and found dial faces with numbers and inscriptions written in ancient Greek. The device had scales for the zodiac and for an Egyptian calendar, a dial keyed to the 19-year metonic cycle that links lunar months to solar years, and a mechanism tied to a cycle used to predict eclipses. Careful readings of the inscriptions and the gearing show a mind at work trying to model irregular lunar motion and to correlate astronomical cycles that were crucial for calendars and religious festivals. That technical detail is the heart of the myth and technology axis. Before Antikythera, the common narrative pictured Hellenistic artisans as skilled at sculpture and weaponry, but lacking in sustained precision mechanics. The mechanism forced a revision. Here was evidence that craftspeople could cut gear teeth with consistent pitch and design nested trains that translated one kind of motion into another in ways that mirror much later clockwork. Reconstructions by mechanical historians show how turning a single crank could advance a set of dials to show the position of the moon, the phase of the moon, and approaching eclipses. Other experimental builds demonstrate how an added train could represent planetary cycles or provide a front dial that books describe in inscrutable inscriptions. On screen, this finds its drama. Computed tomography renderings peel away corroded bronze to reveal hidden wheels turning beneath. Animations show gear teeth meshing and planetary gear motions proposed by modern reconstructions sweeping across a simulated sky. A reconstruction of eclipse prediction plays like a mechanical prophecy where markers click into place as one rotates a hand, overlay a timeline, and the visual tension spikes. The mechanism sits in the late classical world, and then the record of comparable technical survivals goes quiet for centuries until mechanical clocks rise in medieval Europe 1,000 years later. That gap looks like a missing chapter and invites two very different stories. One tale treats the Antikythera device as the product of a local genius or an isolated workshop experiment that did not seed a wider industrial tradition. The other imagined schools of clockwork mastery in port cities and temples taught across generations and lost through war decay and the fragility of metalwork left to see. Which is more likely matters for how we read every other technological myth we encounter. Was Antikythera a single miraculous survivor that we lucked into finding, or a signpost pointing to an entire, vanished culture of analog computing and precision mechanics? Flame leapt across the dark sea like a living thing. Byzantine chroniclers wrote of vessels that vomited fire upon enemy decks, of wooden hulls that burned long after the water closed over them, and of sailors who described a heat that would not be quenched. That is the image that stuck in the medieval mind and in the reports that reach us from the 7th century onward. One tradition credits an engineer named Callinicus of Heliopolis with bringing the secret to Constantinople and giving the empire a weapon that reshaped naval warfare. Other accounts come from Byzantine historians and from military manuals written by court scholars who described tactics for using mounted siphons and for protecting friendly crews from backdraft and splash. Those texts show how central the weapon became to defense and to the empire feeling itself secure upon the sea. In several sieges and naval engagements, contemporaries say Greek fire turned the tide, repelling blockades and protecting the capital when chances seemed lost. That mix of dramatic story and repeated use gives the impression of an organized apparatus rather than a one-off miracle. The technology behind the legend remains stubbornly opaque. Written descriptions emphasize that the substance burned on water and that it was sticky and hard to extinguish. That single detail has driven most modern reconstructions toward petroleum or bitumen-based mixtures. A distillate of oil that floats on water and can be ignited explains why a burning stream would continue to lick a ship even when splashed. Additives such as pine resin and sulfur would thicken the liquid and help it adhere to timber. Other scholars point to quicklime as a reactive ingredient that could flare when exposed to seawater and create blinding clouds or intense heat. A third thread focuses on delivery technology and not chemistry alone. Byzantine iconography and a handful of archaeological fragments suggest that bronze nozzles and fittings were mounted on ship prows and linked to pumps or bellows. Those siphons could force a burning liquid forward in a directed jet. Taken together, the simplest reconstruction looks like this: a flammable blend based on crude oil or naphtha mixed with sticky resins was kept in heated or sealed containers. A hand-operated pump pushed that mix through a bronze tube and out a nozzle. The stream was ignited at the mouth, and the result was a flame that could be steered at an enemy hull. Experimental teams have tested variations on that idea with sobering results. Reenactors and chemists who combine heavy fuel oil with resin find a sticky fire that clings and is hard to smother. Pump rigs demonstrate a reach of several meters with human-powered bellows and hand pumps. Other experiments that add quicklime produce a violent hiss and a cloud, but not a sustained burning stream by itself. That is why the quicklime theory gains most support as a supplement to a petroleum base rather than as a full explanation. The debate is also technical and cultural. Petroleum and refined distillates were known in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East in antiquity and the medieval period. That knowledge could travel in merchant networks and be refined into weapons by military engineers. At the same time, Byzantium jealously guarded secrets of manufacture and of naval deployment. The secrecy around storage recipes and tactical manuals intensified the mystery for later writers and for us. Visual evidence deepens the story. Church frescoes and manuscript illuminations show sailors operating crane-like gear and hoses, and some surviving bronze fittings in museum collections look like they could be nozzles. Maps of key engagements highlight moments where fleets equipped with flame seared an opponent and forced retreats that changed political fortunes. On screen, a reenactment makes the terror immediate. A night attack, orange tongues ripping over water, sailors beating wet cloaks, the smell of tar and resin and burning pitch. Cut to a chemical diagram that paints the blend in simple layers, and to a museum close-up of a corroded bronze fitting that might once have channeled fire. The contested reconstructions matter for how we read technological history. Was Greek fire a lost chemistry breakthrough that vanished because the empire guarded it, and then the knowledge died with those who held it? Or was it a clever marriage of known materials and practical pumps that could have spread but did not for practical or political reasons? Did Byzantine secrecy successfully bury a chemistry breakthrough for centuries? A humble clay jar sparked one of the most persistent technological legends. Archaeologists working near Baghdad in the 1930s recovered a curious set of objects from a Parthian-era layer, or possibly a later Sasanian context depending on who you ask. The group includes a clay pot, a copper tube, and an iron rod that fits inside the tube. The mouth of the jar was sealed in places with bitumen, suggesting someone meant to keep its contents separate from the outside world. That simple assembly is what launched a provocative question. Place two dissimilar metals into an acidic liquid and a small electric current will flow. That is the basic idea behind a galvanic cell. Recreate the Baghdad finds in a modern lab, add vinegar or lemon juice, and you can measure voltage and in controlled runs deposit a thin metallic film onto a surface. Experimental archaeologists have done that and shown the chemistry is real and repeatable. A modest current emerges, and under patient conditions it will plate metal in the way 19th and 20th century scientists demonstrated in their workshops. That is the surprising way a mundane jar became shorthand for ancient electricity. The interpretation moves quickly from plausible chemistry to broad claim. Enthusiasts suggested the jars powered electroplating or were used in early medical treatments or even for decorative gilding. Skeptics pushed back with equal force. They point out that the fine context is problematic. Many of the objects came to scholars through museum purchases rather than intact documented excavations, so precise stratigraphy and associated finds are sparse. Even where the pieces were recorded, the dating can slide by centuries, making any connection to larger technological use uncertain. Critics also ask why we do not see more corroborating evidence in the same layers. There are no clear networks of insulated wiring, no battery racks, and no unmistakable electroplated items from those exact contexts. Practical experiments help explain that absence. Galvanic cells generate low voltages and require acidic fluids and careful maintenance. They corrode quickly, and their byproducts accelerate decay, so short-lived tinkering could leave very little trace. A handful of recreated battery strings can produce enough power to plate a thin leaf of metal in a lab, but doing that reliably for craft production requires numbers of cells and a system to connect them that would leave a different archaeological signature. Alternative functional readings remain persuasive. Similar jars in the region served as storage vessels, ewers, and containers for scrolls or sacred objects. The copper tube might be a pollen funnel or a support for a wooden plug that has long decayed. Bitumen seals appear on many kinds of containers and do not prove an electrical purpose by themselves. On screen, the contrast is arresting. Close-ups of the corroded tubes reveal tool marks and mineral incrustation. Lab reconstructions show a modern student pouring vinegar into a replica and watching a meter tick. Cutaways to museum catalogs and excavation notes underline how fragmentary the provenance can be. Overlay simple graphics that show how a galvanic cell works, and the viewer can see both how convincing and how limited the evidence is. The real fascination is less whether the jars were batteries and more what the possibility implies. If craftsmen in Mesopotamia and its borderlands did tinker with electric effects, what else might they have been probing and experimenting with? And why do so many of those experiments vanish without a clear trace in the archaeological record? A disc of baked clay keeps a workshop secret. Found in 1908 at Phaistos on Crete, the object is a flattened circle stamped with a tight spiral of strange pictograms on both faces. The impressions are crisp and repeatable, 241 symbols in all, each pressed into soft clay rather than scratched in by a stylus. That single fact rewrites how we think about prehistoric record-keeping because it reads like evidence of a toolkit rather than the scratchings of a lone hand. To make those marks, someone would have needed a set of punches, one for each symbol, and the skill to place them in orderly rows that follow the spiral as if guided by a template or a practiced eye. That level of precision suggests a workshop habit where punches were carved and kept, rather than a moment of improvisation at a table. The dating places the disc in the heart of Minoan Crete, a culture already famous for standardized weights, seals, and workshop production in metal and pottery. Yet nothing else matching the disc has been found in the palace archives or in nearby storerooms. That gap is part of the mystery. If a stamping technology existed here, why does it vanish from the archaeological record as suddenly as it appears on this fired disc? The implications are wide. If the punches were conceived as a reusable set, then the disc becomes one early echo of printing, a way to reproduce a fixed text or design quickly and uniformly. It could be a proto-printing plate for ritual texts or talismans, a quick way to make many copies of the same text for distribution during a festival. Alternatively, it might be a unique token, an elaborate label, or a one-off message pressed for a specific ceremony, where the maker used prepared stamps just this once. Scholars have taken both roads and more. Linguists and epigraphers have proposed readings that treat the signs as a script related to the mysterious signs found on other Minoan clay tablets, the system known as Linear A. Others caution that the pictograms do not behave like a full script at all and might encode a list, a mnemonic, or a liturgical formula meant to be performed rather than read in a conventional way. Attempts to decipher the disc have multiplied over the decades with no consensus. Some claims make headlines with plausible-sounding readings, only to be folded back by specialists who point to inconsistent patterns and the disc singularity problem. Experimental work has helped clear some fog. Archaeologists and craftsmen have modeled how carved punches would leave mirrored negative reliefs and how a set of stamps can be arranged to create a smooth spiral without crushing the clay. Replica experiments show that an experienced hand could stamp a plate in minutes once the tools were ready, and that misaligned impressions tell us where a stamp slipped or where templates guided placement. Those physical tests strengthen the argument that the disc reflects a deliberate manufacturing process rather than an accidental or purely decorative act. Comparisons deepen the mystery. Cylinder seals from Mesopotamia and flat seals from Anatolia produce repeated impressions, but they roll or press in a continuous motion and usually leave a border or frame that marks repetition. The Phaistos disc uses distinct isolated punches more like the blocks of later movable systems than like a rolling seal. Yet there are no surviving punches, no molds, and no related stamped tablets from the same levels at Phaistos. That absence forces two hard possibilities. Either the workshop tools were perishable or recycled and so left little trace, or a whole line of production once present in the region decayed without a trace through warfare or simple abandonment. Visually, the disc is irresistible on screen. Close-ups of each pictogram reveal tiny tool marks and consistent depths. An animation can reconstruct a set of carved punches descending in sequence to fill the spiral, and a split screen can show a Mesopotamian seal rolling for comparison so viewers see the difference in method at once. A slow pan across an imagined Minoan workshop with racks of carved stamps hints at an organized artisanship that archaeology has yet to recover. So what should we make of the Phaistos disc, a fired circle that speaks of craft and repetition? Is it the wreckage of a local experiment in proto-printing that never caught on? Or is it a single surviving window into a structured production line that left almost no other trace? Does the manufacturing evidence point to organized workshops we simply have not traced yet, or to an ingenious one-off that fooled future generations into imagining a lost technology? Which explanation rings truer to you, a vanished industry or a solitary artisan with remarkable tools? A flat desert became a skyward map. Where the disk at Phaistos hinted at workshops and stamps, the Nazca Plain offers its own astonishing record cut at a scale that stuns the eye. Long before airplanes skimmed the horizon, locals walked a high, arid basin and left lines and figures so vast they only fully revealed themselves from above. The myths followed quickly. Early 20th century visitors and later popular writers called the geoglyphs airstrips for gods and runways for celestial visitors. Others argued they were precise astronomical markers, a coordinate system written across the sand to track the stars. Both ideas sound dramatic and both tap into our hunger for lost high technology. The archaeological story is quieter and more human. The drawings belong to the people who lived on the coast and in the valleys between 500 before the Common Era and 500 of the Common Era. Those communities built irrigation systems, tended fields, and fashioned pottery while living under a sky so vast that motions of planets and constellation seasons mattered for planting and ritual. Creating the lines was not an act of mystery magic. The top layer of the Nazca soil is a dark, oxidized gravel that hides a lighter, compacted earth beneath. When someone removed the darker stones and swept the surface clean, the contrast remained. And in the desert, that lack of rain can preserve a design for centuries. That simple material fact is the first technical key. The second is method. Scholars have shown that complex shapes can be laid out with nothing more exotic than rope stakes and careful sightlines. Teams of experimenters have recreated straight lines spanning hundreds of meters by planting a baseline with 2 pegs and then stretching a rope and measuring off proportional segments. Curved forms emerge when workers use a long rope held at a fixed radius from a central stake and walk the arc while scraping away the top layer. For large animals and human figures, the work looks like giant drawing by grid. A small-scale sketch can be scaled up by transferring points along intersecting lines and then smoothing the joins. Those are not the tools of high technology, but they are the tools of disciplined surveying and of communal labor organized with skill. Other experiments explored the astronomical claims. Overlaying the geoglyphs with star maps produces moments where certain lines align roughly with solstice sunrises or with bright stars at particular epochs. That can be compelling when a line points toward the horizon position of a star on a festival day. And such alignments suggest the Nazca people watched the sky and used it to orient places and rituals. Caution matters here. The desert is full of lines and the human eye loves pattern. Pick enough directions and you will find some matches. Rigorous tests look for repeated, systematic alignments rather than isolated coincidences. Those tests show a mixed picture. Some lines do seem oriented toward important solar or stellar points, while many appear to follow topography or to guide foot traffic between sacred spring shrines and ceremonial centers. The runway myth collapses under practical scrutiny. To land an aircraft repeatedly, you need smooth approach corridors, a hard surface hidden from winds, and repeatable control zones. The Nazca Plain rarely offers that kind of predictable, engineered runway. There is no archaeological trace of air travel technology in the region in that era, and no consistent pattern of takeoff and landing corridors that would support sustained aviation use. The surveying and ritual hypotheses hold far more weight. On screen, the comparison is persuasive. Drone footage gliding low over a spider or a hummingbird pulls viewers down into the tiny workmen who reaped pebbles, while an overlay maps out the rope and stake method. A split screen shows an archaic star map with a line superimposed to check an equinox bearing. Reenactors in simple clothing press stakes and pull a rope in time lapse, and the geoglyph unfolds in hours from what looked like empty desert. That visual proof carries its own argument. The human effort is the technology. The Nazca lines demand organization, planning, and an understanding of scale and orientation that rivals what we call surveying today. They do not require lost engines or alien landing strips, but they do expose practical skills that modern minds sometimes assume were absent from the past. So were the Nazca workers primitive scribblers on sand, or were they engineers of sightlines and shared calendars who wrote their knowledge into the landscape in permanent script? Which version seems more convincing when you lift your eyes from the ground and follow a single straight line all the way to the horizon where sky and earth meet? A tiny golden object no bigger than a thumb sparked a modern myth of ancient flight. These delicate figures come from the highlands and river valleys of what is now Colombia and are usually tied to the Quimbaya cultural horizon, which flourished between the 1st and 7th centuries of the Common Era. Archaeologists recovered many of them in funerary contexts where goldwork accompanied the dead as offerings or markers of status. That simple provenance matters because it anchors the objects in ritual and memory rather than in workshops devoted to experimental engineering. The pieces themselves are exquisite, made with lost wax casting, a technique where an artist models a shape in wax, covers it in clay, bakes the clay, and melts the wax away, leaving a cavity to pour molten metal into. They are hollow, light, and often highly stylized. Look closely and you see hammered lines, delicate joins, and tiny pins where elements were attached. X-ray images and close inspection reveal core materials and casting seams that belong to a refined tradition of metallurgy and iconography. The controversy begins with a handful of figures whose silhouettes read to modern eyes like wings, tail fins, and streamlined fuselages. Photographs published in the middle of the 20th century paired these shapes with images of airplanes, and the idea spread fast. For some readers, the resemblance was too striking to ignore, and a new narrative took hold that ancient Americans had either invented flight or observed advanced aerodynamic forms long before history recorded them. Art history offers another reading that fits the archaeological context. Pre-Columbian artists loved compression and transformation. Birds, fish, frogs, and canoe forms appear again and again across regions and centuries, often folded into hybrid creatures that combine features for symbolic effect. A beak might double as a prow. A pair of stylized wings can signal speed or spiritual ascent rather than lift in the technical sense. Many Quimbaya pieces echo local myths, cosmologies, and daily life, including fish and water motifs that make sense along river networks and coastal trade routes. When you place these gold figures beside textile patterns, pottery designs, and carved stelae from the same era, the family resemblances multiply and point toward a shared visual language rather than a secret aeronautical manual. Pareidolia plays a central role in the story. The human brain seeks patterns and will match a partial shape to a familiar object when context is slim. The arrival of airplanes in the early 20th century primed imaginations so that a streamlined curve became an instant signal for flight to modern observers. That modern bias also comes with selective attention. Photographs and museum displays often isolate the figurines from the tomb assemblages that give them meaning, and then place them against images of jet fighters or mail planes without the cultural anchors that would show other plausible identifications. Some experimentalists have tried to close the loop with physical tests. Hobbyists and fringe researchers have built scaled replicas and held rudimentary glide trials. A few models can coast briefly when thrown from a height, but they lack stabilizing control surfaces and cannot reproduce controlled, sustained flight. Those results underline a practical problem. A small gold object that glides poorly is a far cry from a craft designed to carry people and instruments, and from a tradition of aeronautical knowledge that would leave clearer infrastructure and records. On screen, the debate is easy to stage and hard to settle. Close-ups of fine tool marks and X-ray scans that reveal hollow chambers emphasize craftsmanship. Split-screen comparisons with birds can show how a beak and tail combine to form an elegant abstraction. Overlays that place the same figures against airplane silhouettes make the psychological leap visible so viewers can feel how modern eyes impose meaning. Shots of tomb assemblages restore context and remind us these were objects meant for ritual passage and memory. So were Quimby goldsmiths sketching flying machines, or were they shaping metaphors of movement, status, and spirit that our era misreads as blueprints? Which reading fits the evidence and which fits our longing to find lost technologies in the golden past? Some blades seemed almost alive. Medieval travelers and court poets told stories of swords that bent without breaking, snapped shields with a single stroke, and even smoothed out small nicks as if the metal remembered its shape. Those stories wrapped themselves around a reputation called Damascus steel, named after the great medieval markets of the Levant where finished blades were traded and admired. European knights coveted them. Islamic scholars and metalworkers wrote recipes and praises. Surviving blades carried names and histories that fed a legend of almost supernatural performance. The real story travels farther back and sideways. Archaeologists and chemical analysis point to a source in the rich ore and skilled crucible work of South Asia, where a type of ingot steel known in historic records as woots was smelted and exported across long trade routes. Craftsmen in Syrian and Arabian workshops took these ingots and forged them into finished blades. The magic was not in a single place, but in a chain of skills and materials that crossed oceans and bazaars. What made those blades special is written at a scale invisible to the naked eye. Under magnification, surviving Damascus blades show banded patterns like flowing water and a complex microstructure of hard carbides and softer metal around them. In the last decades, researchers have described microscopic filaments and networks in some samples that resemble modern carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires. Those formations act like bridges between hard particles and the surrounding steel matrix, and they help explain how a blade can combine a razor edge with flexible toughness. The pattern you see on the surface is not decoration alone. It is the surface expression of a long history of melting, forging, thermal cycling, and chemical conditions that force carbon to segregate into particular shapes. The crucible technique at the heart of the story matters because it controls chemistry in a way forged smelting cannot. Make a sealed crucible melt iron with a carbon source and allow it to absorb carbon slowly under reducing conditions, and you end up with an ingot whose internal chemistry can be far richer and more uniform than ordinary bloomery steel. Trace impurities in the ore like vanadium, molybdenum, and chromium, if present in tiny amounts, encourage the formation of hard carbide networks rather than a single brittle cast. Those impurities act like seed crystals, guiding the growth of microscopic structures during slow cooling. Later, a smith hammers and heats the ingot skillfully to align and refine those carbides into the flowing bands associated with classic Damascus patterns. Thermal cycling plays a starring role. Repeated cycles of heating, cooling, forging, and quenching change how carbon and other elements migrate within the metal. Each cycle can weld layers close and break apart brittle regions, then mend them in a different arrangement. That repeated choreography is as much craft as chemistry. Modern investigators who tried to reproduce authentic microstructures learned that missing one ingredient in the sequence or altering the cooling rate by a little can produce a blade that looks similar but behaves differently. That sensitivity helps explain why the original process proved so hard to replicate. Modern attempts to recreate Damascus have been part laboratory science and part artisanal experiment. Metallurgists analyze surviving fragments with electron microscopes and spectrometers, while contemporary smiths test recipes in the heat of a forge. Some reconstructions recreate the surface patterns and deliver excellent cutting edges. Others fail to reproduce the same microscopic networks that earlier studies reported. The problem is partly materials and partly context. Ancient ore compositions varied by mine. Crucible clays and added fluxes changed reactions. The skillful hands that controlled heating and hammer strikes moved in rhythms not easily documented in a treatise. Added to that is a messy archaeological record. Many original blades have been recycled or corroded, and precise workshop notes rarely survive. The story widens when you factor trade and secrecy. Wootz ingots moved along maritime and overland lines from South Asia to the Middle East and beyond. Makers in the Levant may have guarded final forging techniques like guild secrets. When trade patterns shifted or raw materials became scarce, a key link in the chain could break without leaving a written explanation. In that sense, a lost technology is not always a single lost machine, but a vanished workflow stitched across places and people. On screen, the contrast between scales is compelling. Microscopic imagery reveals lattices and filaments that look like miniature bridges. Manuscript illuminations show proud smiths presenting blades in courtly hands. Footage of modern forges captures the rhythm of hammer and fire and the quiet adjustments that no microscope can record. Put those images together and the mystery sharpens rather than fades. So did exchanges of artisanal tricks and guarded recipes hide a material's technology we still only partially understand, or do surviving blades point to a confluence of rare conditions that a few gifted smiths once exploited and which modern methods mimic but cannot fully match? Which part of that vanished chain do you think we are closest to recovering, and which part might be forever lost to time? A 7-meter column of iron stands almost unchanged beneath the Delhi sky. For centuries, people whispered that its makers guarded a secret recipe that made iron immortal. The object sits near the Qut complex, where generations have admired its smooth, dark surface and wondered how a metal exposed to the elements for more than 1,600 years could avoid the usual orange of rust. Archaeologists date the pillar to the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. An early Sanskrit inscription on its base links the monument to the age of Gupta power and to an official who commissioned a public tribute to a king and to Dharma. Scientific study adds detail that complicates myth without draining its mystery. Chemical analysis shows unusually high phosphorus content in the iron and low sulfur and low carbon when compared with many contemporaneous blooms. That chemistry matters because phosphorus encourages the growth of a protective film on the metal surface. Over time, a thin layer rich in iron phosphate forms and bonds to the iron beneath. Once established, that film slows further corrosion by keeping water and oxygen from reacting freely with fresh metal. Climate helps too. Delhi sits in a largely dry region where long stretches without heavy rain reduce the cycles of wetting and drying that accelerate rust. Combine a protective chemical coating with a favorable climate and preservation becomes much easier than a casual glance suggests. The pillar also speaks to technical skill. Making a 7-meter wrought iron column requires repeated heating, hammering, and forge welding of large blooms. Craftsmen had to select or control furnace conditions and manage slag impurities so that phosphorus survived in the metal rather than being lost. The presence of a coherent high phosphorus wrought iron suggests more than luck. It points to workshop practices that could intentionally shape chemistry through choice of ore and by tuning smelting and consolidation steps. Modern metallurgists who examined cross-sections describe a finely worked microstructure with patterns that record cycles of forging and thermal treatment. Experimental archaeometallurgists have recreated similar iron by using bloomery methods and by deliberately choosing ore that carried higher phosphorus. Those reconstructions produce material that weathers into a similar protective film when left exposed for a long time. Visuals make the point clear. Close-ups of the pillar show a dark patina pitted in places but overall stable. Diagrams of iron microstructures reveal carbide slag pockets and the thin continuous phosphate coating that matters most for corrosion resistance. Historical reconstructions of ancient Indian foundries suggest teams of smiths working in coordinated stages with shared recipes and techniques passed from master to apprentice. And voices in the field are measured. One metallurgist notes that the pillar shows both empirical knowledge and craft mastery rather than supernatural chemistry. Another points out that some of the preservation is due to long-term environmental luck layered on top of skill. That leaves the question unresolved in a way that keeps the story alive. Was the pillar the happy result of available ore, a practiced forge crew, and favorable climate, a scientific accident preserved by circumstance? Or was it the product of institutional knowledge and refined metallurgical practice that later generations failed to document and preserve? Which explanation feels more like the work of hands and which feels like the work of a lost tradition? Some ancient harbors still keep their original stonework beneath the waves. Sailors and divers long ago noticed Roman piers and breakwaters that seemed to weather the sea better than later masonry. Legends grew that the Romans guarded a secret recipe that made their concrete almost immortal. That story moved from romance into science when researchers began cutting cores from submerged structures at places like Pozzuoli and Baiae and looking at them under the microscope. What they found surprised everyone. The mortar contains crystalline minerals that form only when volcanic ash reacts with lime and seawater. Tiny sheets of aluminum tobamorite and particles of philipsite grow inside the mix and bind the whole mass together in a way modern mixes do not. Explain that process in plain terms and it sounds beautifully simple. The Romans mixed lime made from heated limestone with a volcanic ash we now call pozzolana. When that blend met seawater, a chemical dance began. Silica and alumina in the ash dissolved slowly and combined with the lime to form new binding minerals instead of just leaving behind a brittle mass. Over years and decades, those minerals continued to crystallize and to fill microcracks. The material literally heals itself as the sea works on it. The technical word for that behavior is pozzolanic reaction. Pozzolanic describes how certain natural ashes activate when combined with lime and water to form stable calcium silicate hydrates and related minerals. The Romans had a practical knowledge of where to get the right ash. They quarried tough and volcanic sand from the Campanian fields around Mount Vesuvius and from nearby islands and brought it to harbors and docks. Builders placed the mix in wooden forms, drove piles, and let seawater finish the curing process. Chemical analysis, microscopy, and accelerated aging experiments in modern labs helped close the loop between myth and mechanism. Scientists reproduce the old recipes, then heat or frost them to simulate centuries in a matter of weeks. The Roman mixes often outperform modern ordinary concrete in tests that measure resistance to salt attack and cracking. That does not mean Roman concrete is perfect for every use. Modern Portland cement allows fast setting and very high early strength for skyscrapers and highways. The 19th century industrial boom favored that method because it matched mass production and speed. Over time, the exact recipes and quarrying habits that made the Roman harbor mixes special faded along with the building traditions that supported them. Political collapse, shifting trade routes, and a taste for new industrial chemistries all helped the knowledge slip from common practice into scattered notes and chance survival in submerged ruins. That gap is exactly why engineers study Roman samples today. Recreating pozzolanic systems that cure in seawater could cut emissions from modern cement by relying less on high-temperature kilns and more on low-temperature reactions with natural volcanic materials. Materials scientists have even synthesized aluminum tobamorite in the lab to learn how to nudge microstructures toward durability and how to encourage self-healing. CGI sequences of Roman dockyards, cross-sections exposing crystalline growth, and lab footage of accelerated aging tests make the idea tangible on screen. The looks of ancient workers packing a pozzolana mix into wooden molds and the slow bloom of mineral crystals under a microscope tell two parts of the same story. So what if the Romans were not merely lucky but intentional? Did their builders experiment generation after generation to tune mixes for marine exposure and long-term performance? And can those old recipes teach us how to build more sustainable infrastructure for the future? A wall of stone so vast it reads like a mountain stands at Baalbek. Locals and travelers have long told stories that sound like myth and machine. Some speak of giants and titans who set the blocks in place. Others whisper of a vanished toolkit more clever than any technology we recognize. The truth begins with what is visible. The Roman temple platform rests on earlier foundations, and those foundations are built from megaliths so large that a casual glance makes them feel impossible. Dozens of blocks weigh many hundreds of tons each, and the famous trilithon of 3 monoliths sits in a single row with faces smoothed and joints fit so tightly you cannot slip a finger between them. A short walk from the platform is a quarry at Hajar al-Hibla where enormous unfinished stones lie where ancient masons left them. One of those quarry blocks, known locally as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, is a hulking mass cut from bedrock but never moved. That pair of images, the placed megaliths and the stalled quarry, keeps the mystery alive. Archaeology layers the story without killing the wonder. The Romans rebuilt and embellished a sacred precinct over earlier work, and they brought monumental ambition to bear on a site already sacred and already engineered. The quarry shows the raw ambition of stonecutters who could shape blocks at the source. The presence of unfinished giants hints that choices about moving or abandoning huge stones were practical decisions, not supernatural failures. How would ancient hands have managed such loads? Think in practical terms, and the list starts with familiar tools. Earth ramps built from packed soil and rubble can create gentle slopes to haul blocks upward. Levers and timber cribbing allow gradual lifts and repositioning 1 inch at a time. Teams of workers manning capstans and winches can pull with synchronized power that multiplies individual effort. Rollers placed under a sledge or timber rails greased with oil or wet clay can cut friction to a fraction of its dry value. Rigging with hemp ropes and block and tackle-like arrangements that multiply force could have lifted or shifted smaller increments safely. Experimental archaeology fills the imagination with demonstrated possibilities. Recreated sledges hauled by hundreds of people across lubricated tracks can move multi-ton blocks over kilometers. Full-scale trials show that by breaking a massive task into many small lifts and moves, and by using simple mechanical advantage, you reduce risk and distribute effort. Conservative estimates from engineers who study ancient methods suggest that a well-organized workforce equipped with ramps and basic hoisting gear could position stones that look impossible. The main barrier becomes organization rather than mystery. Still, the specifics matter. Moving a block weighing many hundreds of tons is not the same as moving a temple column weighing a few tons. The logistics change. You need staging areas to build and maintain ramps, you need timber in surprising quantities, and you need a supply chain for ropes and skilled labor that can work in tight coordination for months or years. That is why some stones at Baalbek remain at the quarry. Sometimes the cost of moving 1 more block outweighs the benefit of leaving an already monumental foundation. Visual evidence sharpens both awe and explanation. Aerial photographs reveal the quarry faces the shallow trenches and the very straight lines of sections cut free. Diagrams that animate hypothetical ramps and cradles make the geometry clear and show how an inclined plane reduces required pull force by a large fraction. Comparative shots that place a modern truck or an elephant silhouette beside a trilithon block let viewers grasp scale instantly. Interviews with stone-moving experts and experimental archaeologists often return to the same theme. They do not need fanciful machines to explain Baalbek. They point to methodical engineering, human organization, and the willingness to invest time and material into a single monumental gesture. Yet the mystery refuses to melt away entirely. Why carve stones so colossal that moving them became marginally practical? Why leave near-perfect unfinished blocks at the quarry? Those choices suggest cultural meanings that exceed pure efficiency. They also leave room for another possibility. Could there once have been specialized machinery tools or rigging techniques so effective that their forms did not survive because they were made of wood or rope and returned to decay? Did a vanished tradition of heavy lifting exist that relied on perishable components and craft secrets passed orally and then lost? Is the puzzle of Baalbek really an issue of scale and daring, or does it point to a heavy lifting toolkit that our sources have not yet let us touch? A ring of stones could have been a temple, a calendar, and a concert hall all at once. Ancient storytellers and modern thrill seekers both wrapped Stonehenge in wonder. Some called it a place of healing where the blue stones mended broken bodies and soothed troubled minds. Others treated it as a giant observatory, a stone clock that read the sky and predicted the turning seasons. And older legends whispered that giants or otherworldly hands placed the stones as if a normal workforce could not have managed the task. Those narratives point to a single idea. People have long assumed the builders possessed secret knowledge about sound or stars long before such skills should have existed. The archaeological record gives us a different kind of story without draining its mystery. Building began in the late Neolithic and continued into the early Bronze Age across many phases from 3000 to 2000 before the Common Era. The earliest works were earthworks and timber circles roughly aligned to solar points. Later, the great Sarsen uprights were raised and set in lintel pairs. The bluestones, which made Stonehenge special, arrived from the Preseli Hills in what is now Western Wales, a journey of about 200 kilometers or more depending on the route taken. Bronze Age people added and rearranged stones over generations, so what stands now is the outcome of slow accretion rather than a single master plan. That slow building does not remove cleverness. It reframes it. Move a handful of striking facts into view and you start to see the technologies implied. Transporting the bluestones from distant hills required logistics and route planning. Experimental archaeologists have shown how sledges, rollers, and timber cradles combined with cordage and human muscle can haul multi-ton stones across land. River craft rafts and coastal barges could shorten the overland leg and add levers for final placement. Reconstructions filmed with time-lapse computer-generated imagery show how a team could shift a bluestone from a coastal landing to a prepared hole using timber ramps and packed earth. Those sequences do not feel like magic. They feel like patient engineering and large-scale coordination. The alignments tell a complementary technical tale. The great axis of the monument points toward the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. When you stand inside the circle on midsummer morning, the sun rises along a carefully defined avenue that frames the horizon through uprights and gaps. That kind of sightline is not the product of a single inspired night. It is the product of long observation and repeated adjustment. Farmers and ritual specialists watched the sun year after year and marked its extremes. Over generations, they could refine stakes and sightlines until a stone set in place locked an alignment that had been tested by living memory. Some researchers argue for more elaborate celestial readings. Lines drawn from the circle could track lunar extremes and the risings of bright stars used in navigation and ritual. Animations that overlay ancient star maps onto the monument make those links feel tangible. Yet precision is relative. A well-chosen horizon point and a few careful markers can deliver useful calendrical cues without requiring telescopes or tables of complex mathematics. Sound opens another door. The bluestones themselves, when struck, can produce clear musical tones and resonances. Acoustic studies have demonstrated that the ring and its surrounding earthworks shape low-frequency reverberations and standing waves. Walkers at certain spots report a subjective hum and a sense of altered space. Acoustic engineers have recorded amplified frequencies that linger and interact with human voices. Those effects can change how a ritual feels and how people respond to a spoken prayer or a sung lament. A circle of resonant stones is a technology for the senses. It manipulates sound like a wooden echo chamber or a carved bell. That gives the monument practical ritual functions that look like technology because they shape experience deliberately. The counters to the mechanical reading are important. Stonehenge was multifunctional across centuries. Finds in and around the site include burials, domestic refuse, and traces of feasting. That argues for a community hub where ritual commemoration, seasonal gathering, and burial interwove. incremental construction complicates the idea of a single breakthrough technology. If people returned generation after generation to reshape the monument, each new configuration could embody local memory and incremental improvements rather than a lost master plan carried intact from the first builders. Archaeologists also caution about cherry-picking. Singling out one alignment or an isolated acoustic test risks overstating intent. Landscape engineering is a spectrum of skill from basic observation to sophisticated planning. Stonehenge sits somewhere on that range. On screen, the tension is irresistible. You can animate the solstice sun sliding along a sight line and then cut to hands shaping a bluestone for transport. Time-lapse footage of reconstructed hauling rigs gives muscle and scale to the labor. Acoustic demos let viewers hear the bell-like tones of struck bluestones and feel how a shallow depression in the bank focuses a hymn. Close-ups of burial goods and carved antler picks remind us that funerary practice and community life powered the work as much as any celestial curiosity. So which way does the evidence tip? Were the builders proto-engineers mapping the heavens and mastering sound as ritual technology, or were they skilled people using simple tools and long memories to craft meanings in stone? The answer may be both, and the real surprise is how inventive ritual tech and landscape engineering appear when we stop looking for sudden genius and start listening to the long, patient work of generations. Stone by stone, the pyramids teach a lesson about human planning rather than alien intervention. Stories still swirl that lost machines or unearthly hands must have set those massive blocks in place, but the archaeological record tells a subtler story. The great monuments on the Giza Plateau date to the Old Kingdom, around 2,600 years before the Common Era, and they sit inside a wider landscape of quarries, workshops, and worker settlements that point toward a human solution. Camps once thought to house slaves are now understood as organized villages with bakeries that produced thousands of loaves, dormitories, medical treatment areas, and cemeteries honoring the men who labored there. Those remains changed the tone from myth to logistics. People lived, ate, healed, and were buried near the pyramids, which argues for a sustained, skilled workforce rather than a mystical labor force that vanished without trace. The technical details that drive conspiracy thrive because the stones look impossible from a distance. Yet engineers and archaeologists have sketched very plausible methods. Ramps feature in almost every model for moving blocks. The simplest idea uses straight ramps built from earth and rubble that workers hauled stone up as the platform rose. Other proposals envision zigzag ramps along the pyramid faces or spiral ramps hugging the structure. A bolder suggestion puts parts of the ramp inside the monument itself where hidden passageways carried blocks upward. Each ramp idea has strengths and limits. A long straight ramp demands an enormous amount of fill and would alter the sightline of the structure until it was removed. Spiral and zigzag schemes reduce the material but complicate turning heavy loads around tight corners. Internal ramp models solve the external bulk problem but require precise construction and leave traces that are hard to find. We do have a concrete hint about how people eased the friction of hauling. An Old Kingdom tomb painting shows a massive statue being dragged on a sledge while a figure pours water in front of the runners. That image is consistent with experiments that demonstrate how a thin film of water reduces friction on a sandy surface, dramatically cutting the number of workers needed to move a heavy load. Modern teams have replicated that method with sledges and ropes and found that a coordinated crew can move multi-ton blocks across prepared surfaces without engines and without exotic tools. Those demonstrations do not romanticize the past. They show how practical physics and disciplined labor solve problems that seem otherworldly at first glance. Tool marks in quarries and on dressed faces speak to the limits and ingenuity of ancient technology. Bronze Age copper tools are relatively soft, yet copper chisels used with repeated striking and with abrasive sand can shape local limestone with great finesse. Harder stones like red granite were not cut with copper alone. Workers used dolerite pounding stones, pecking and grinding away slowly, and they combined persistent hammering with sand as an abrasive to grind precise surfaces. Achieving the famously tight joints sometimes seen in passages required patient finishing, rubbing stones together with grit until the faces matched. Those techniques are labor-intensive but not mechanically impossible. Experimental archaeologists and stonemasons have reproduced millimeter-tight fits with nothing more than bronze tools, stone hammers, and hours of careful dressing. Inside the Great Pyramid, modern surveys and three-dimensional scans reveal astonishing internal geometry and previously unknown voids discovered in the early 21st century. Passageways pitch and turn with measured angles, chambers align with the sky in symbolic ways, and the masonry tolerances are tight enough to accentuate light and shadow dramatically. Those internal features spur the hardest questions. How did builders plan complex internal layouts before they closed the outer shell? And how did they maintain alignment during construction across a project that could take decades? The answers lie partly in measured surveying techniques. The Egyptians used simple but effective tools to orient themselves, such as plumb bobs, sighting rods and ropes knotted at intervals for measuring. Survey stations on the plateau aligned features by repeated sightings of horizon points and by working from fixed reference corners. Think of it as low-tech control points spread across a vast project, a method an architect would recognize even today. Logistics becomes the silent technology behind every lifted stone. Quarrying schedules, food supply chains, seasonal labor rotation tied to the agricultural calendar, teams trained in lifting and hauling gestures, and oversight systems to coordinate hundreds or thousands of workers all functioned as a kind of social machinery. Evidence from workers' villages shows organized bakeries and large storage pits that kept a steady flow of provisions. Tomb inscriptions and administrative papyri from other sites reveal lists of rations allocations and task groups with names and job descriptions. Those records hint at management practices that turned physical labor into predictable progress over years. Visual reconstructions bring these ideas alive on screen. Animated sequences can flesh ramps from earth and rock while teams of workers pull with ropes and apply water to the sand in time, lapse so the thousand hands become a single coordinated force. Footage of quarrying experiments shows how pounding and grinding with dolerite breaks granite down into manageable blocks. Three-dimensional scans peel open the pyramid to reveal internal chambers and the precision of masonry joints. Close-ups of the worker village excavations show hearths, bakery ovens, and the painted graffiti and meal vessels that tether laborers to ordinary life. Still, not every question is closed. The precision of certain internal passages, the method used to raise the heaviest capstones, and the exact administrative techniques that scheduled labor across seasons remain debated in detail. What seems clear is that the true marvel of pyramid building is less a lost mechanical engine and more a social engine. The final puzzle lingers like a single chiseled face in a shaft of sunlight. Even if human hands with rope, stone, and bronze could place every block, what was the organizational technology that transformed dozens of independent crews into a cumulative machine capable of building the monument that still defines the horizon? A ring of carved pillars rises from a landscape where farming had not yet taken root. Göbekli Tepe sits on a ridge in what is now southeastern Anatolia and dates to around 9,600 before the Common Era, a time when people are usually thought to have been small, mobile bands hunting and gathering. Instead, archaeologists found enclosures built of massive limestone pillars carved in relief with snakes, boars, foxes, birds, and abstract symbols. The pillars are shaped in the form of the letter T, and some reach heights taller than a person, carved with surprising finesse and arranged into circular courts that required careful planning to lay out and to erect. Excavations show deep pits filled with stone debris, carved fragments, and the remains of communal feasting rather than house floors, which is one of the clues that something unusual was happening at this place. There is little evidence for permanent fields nearby. The crops and steady settlements that typically supply large construction projects do not appear in the record here at that early date. That gap forces a different kind of question. How did people without settled agriculture quarry stone, lift and dress megaliths and coordinate dozens, and perhaps hundreds of hands to shape these enclosures and then bury them deliberately when use was finished? The technologies visible at Göbekli Tepe are not machines so much as social machines. Stone working requires know-how. The limestone pillars were cut from bedrock and finished with flint and stone tools by teams who understood angles, leverage, and basic lifting techniques. Experimental archaeology shows how wedges and channels could separate blocks from a quarry, and how ropes, levers, and packed earth could raise and position heavy stones without metal devices. The carvings themselves demand repeatable tool strokes and an eye for composition, which suggests specialist craftsmen and apprentices practicing techniques across seasons. Mobilizing labor without farms points to organizational innovations that function as technology in their own right. Shared rituals can act like a scheduling system. Large feasts and ceremonies provide the social currency that persuades mobile groups to gather in one place for extended periods, to share food and to exchange obligations. Food surplus does not need to come from local fields. It can be brought in, redistributed, and turned into a social investment that builds prestige and obligation. Leaders and ritual specialists who could coordinate procurement, direct work parties, and maintain memory of plans act as human software running complex projects. Networks of exchange that carried raw materials and ideas between distant bands serve as infrastructure. In other words, the project management, the calendars, the ritual protocols, and the knowledge transmission systems are all forms of what we might call organizational technology. They do the same work that a supply chain or an office hierarchy does in modern construction, but they are built from promises, songs, taboos, and shared ceremony. Those are hard things to dig up in a trench, but their traces appear in unexpected ways. Layers of animal bone and charred grain kernels hint at planned feasts. Repeated decorative motifs across pillars suggest templates or master craftsmen copying a shared visual language. The deliberate burial of the enclosures implies long-term planning and memory management, a choice to close one chapter so another could begin elsewhere. Visually, the site is cinematic. Wide drone pans show concentric courts stepping down the ridge. Close-ups reveal hooked beaks and coiled snakes carved in deep relief. Reconstructions animate teams wielding stone hammers and wooden levers, while time-lapse graphics map how social cohesion curves upward as gatherings grow from a few families to hundreds of participants. Those images make a different kind of technological story convincing. Göbekli Tepe does not require unknown engines hidden underground. It requires people who invented effective ways to organize, to teach, and to motivate at a scale that we usually credit to settled farmers. That realization forces a sharper question. If ritual networks and seasonal mobilization enabled monumental construction before agriculture, then have we been reading the sequence of human innovation backward? And does Göbekli Tepe force us to rethink when humans first began engineering large-scale projects and the social technologies that made them possible? Some sculptures began their lives far from the plazas where they would preside. Giant stone faces rise from the clay of Olmec sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo, their features carved with patient strokes and eyes that still fix the horizon. These are the colossal heads, carved from dense basalt quarried not nearby but in the Tuxtla Mountains, carried away from the source and set down in ceremonial centers dating from 1500 to 400 before the Common Era. The stones themselves are heavy, often weighing many tons, and the distances involved range from tens to hundreds of kilometers across rivers, swamps, and ridged terrain. That distance is the heart of the puzzle that turns practical craft into legend. The obvious first explanations are workaday engineering. Log rollers and timber sledges can reduce friction. River corridors can carry weight that mountains cannot. A raft tied to a dugout or an array of bundled reeds can float a boulder downstream, and teams of coordinated laborers can haul stones from shore to plaza with capstans, ropes, and carefully leveled ramps. Archaeologists point to evidence of earthen causeways, leveled quays, and altered river channels near Olmec centers as signs that people planned routes for moving heavy cargo. Experimental archaeologists have reconstructed scaled rafts and dragged stone replicas to test how many hands and what kinds of simple machines would be required, and those trials show surprising efficiency when a community works to a shared plan. Skeptics push the picture another way. Moving a 50-ton head across upland slopes or through swampy forest looks less like everyday hauling and more like a specialized industry. That is where proposals of hydraulic or mechanical innovation surface. Some scholars suggest canals or temporary waterways dug to shorten overland legs, sluices that raised stones a little at a time, or clever cradle systems that reduced rocking and prevented breakage while logs and rollers took the load. Others point to possible wooden rollers lubricated with plant oils or woven mats that served as sacrificial surfaces to protect stone and timber from abrasion. Those ideas fit a world where timber and cordage were abundant and where ritual prestige could justify the labor cost of experimental devices. The debate turns on a few stubborn points. Perishable materials like wood, rope, and reed leave little archaeological trace, so absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. Quarry faces and unfinished boulders at the Tuxtla source show direct links between raw material and finished monuments, but the pathways between quarry and plaza are often inconspicuous in the soil record. At the same time, the Olmec built earthen mounds, plazas, and drainage works that demonstrate large-scale, coordinated construction beyond random laboriously. Those social structures are as much a technological tool as any pulley or channel. Organizing hundreds of people to feed them, shelter them, and schedule their work is itself a form of engineering, a human scale machine that moves stone as surely as any raft. On screen, the story is irresistible. A map traces a basalt boulder winding from the Tuxtla Hills along paleo riverbeds to La Venta. A clay model shows how a stone rests in a wooden cradle as rafts patch across a muddy estuary. Time-lapse footage of modern teams trying to haul a replica stone across a wet flat lets viewers hear the creak of ropes, the slap of water, and the chant of coordinated effort. Close-ups of carved chisel marks at the quarry connect the sculptor and the hauler in a single long labor. When experimental rigs succeed and when they fail, the drama is plain people inventing and adapting rather than finding a single secret machine. That tension returns us to the underlying question. Does the scale of the Olmec feat point to forgotten engineering conventions lost to decay and time, or does it celebrate an impressive but ultimately achievable organization of people, tools, and landscape that only looks impossible from a distance? A glass cup refuses to be just one color. The Lycurgus cup is the kind of object that makes scientists and storytellers argue over the same light for different reasons. A 4th century Roman cage cup carved with a continuous scene of a mythic king appears green when you look at it in reflected light and burns a deep ruby red when you hold it up to the sun. The trick is not paint or varnish but metal trapped inside the glass. Modern analysis shows minute particles of gold and silver suspended in the matrix. Those particles are so small that they scatter and absorb light differently than a chunk of metal wood, and the result is a shifting palette that felt like magic for nearly 2,000 years. When researchers turned to spectroscopy and electron microscopy, they found the telltale signatures of nanoparticles. Spectroscopy measures how a material interacts with light and gives a fingerprint for the kinds of particles present. Electron microscopy lets you see structure at the tiny scale by using an electron beam instead of a light beam to reveal shapes and clusters far below what the eye can resolve. Under those tools, the cup reveals clusters of gold and silver measured on the scale of billionths of a meter. Those clusters tune themselves to certain wavelengths of light so that transmission through the thin vessel favors red tones while surface reflection scatters green. That phenomenon is called dichroism. It happens in modern dichroic glass and in stained glass derived from later recipes, but seeing it in a Roman work tied to a high degree of craftsmanship changed how people think about ancient material science. The central question is whether the effect was an accident of chemistry or a controlled, repeatable craft. On the one hand, the physical evidence argues for intention. The particle sizes on the cup are not wildly random. They cluster in ranges that create a predictable optical effect. The distribution of particles often concentrates where the glasswork required the deepest color or the thinnest wall. Other Roman and late antique glass fragments show similar metal inclusions and color effects, which hints at shared workshop recipes or trade in colored glass blanks. Written sources from antiquity and later medieval periods mention recipes for colored glass and for adding metal filings to produce particular hues. All of that reads like a tradition passed between smiths and glassworkers, a body of empirical knowledge about heat, atmosphere, and metal salts rather than a one-off fluke. On the other hand, the manufacturing conditions needed to get nanoparticles right are delicate. Formation of metallic colloids in glass depends on temperature, on the chemical makeup of the glass, on how long the pot is held at certain heats, and on subtle redox conditions that either reduce metal ions into tiny clusters or leave them dissolved. Without control, a batch can produce dull browns or muddy hues rather than the jewel-like dichroism of the Lycurgus cup. That sensitivity makes the wonder rare and explains why so few intact examples survive. It also opens the possibility that an isolated workshop hit the right combination by skill or luck, and that subsequent generations failed to recreate it often enough for a continuous tradition to persist. On screen, this material drama translates beautifully. A dynamic lighting demonstration can show the cup turning from emerald to ruby with a single motion. Close-ups can reveal the finely cut cage, the tiny bubbles, and the subtle thickness changes where the color shifts are strongest. Microscopic images can dissolve the surface into landscapes of shimmering particles. Side-by-side footage of modern dichroic glass production shows artists deliberately depositing thin metal layers or creating controlled colloids and yields a striking comparison. The modern process looks systematic and repeatable, while the ancient object looks both deliberate and fragile in its mastery. There are also cultural reasons the recipe might have disappeared. Workshops guarded secrets, trade in high-value objects moved through elites who controlled knowledge often for status and profit. A rare mix used for luxurious cups or imperial gifts could easily remain proprietary and die out when a workshop closed or political networks shifted. That human factor sits beside the technical one and makes a lost recipe plausible without invoking mystical knowledge beyond the craftspeople of the age. So where does that leave us with the idea of Roman nanotechnology? Were glassworkers in late antiquity manipulating matter at scales invisible to the naked eye with rules they understood? Or were they highly skilled empiricists who hit a precise chemistry now hard to reproduce without modern measuring tools? Did they teach apprentices a suite of thermal moves and chemical hints that allowed controlled particle formation? Or did secrecy, scarcity, and the delicate nature of the method cause it to fade until modern microscopes could finally read the code? The Lycurgus cup sits between those two possibilities and keeps pulling us back to the question of what counts as technology when beauty depends on mastery of the very small. A little pointer on a chariot supposedly never lost its sense of south. Ancient Chinese chronicles from the 3rd century of the Common Era describe a cart that carried a figure or vane that always faced south no matter how the vehicle turned. Later mechanical treatises and anecdotal histories build on that image and credit engineers like Ma Zheng with perfecting the idea during the Age of the Three Kingdoms. The way those sources talk about the device is practical, not mystical, and that is where the mechanical detective work begins. scholars long ago noticed that the descriptions rule out magnetism and supernatural guidance. They pointed instead to a clever bit of mechanics, something that translates how far each wheel turns into a correction that keeps a pointer aligned. Think of the chariot as having two drive wheels on either side of its axle. If the vehicle runs straight, both wheels rotate the same amount. If the chariot turns, one wheel turns more and the other less. A gear train that combines those two rotations can be made to turn a pointer by the exact amount the cart has rotated, but in the opposite direction. The result is a pointer that cancels the cart rotation and so stays fixed relative to the land or to a chosen compass direction. That trick is the basic idea behind a differential gear. In plain words, a differential is a small machine that compares two rotations and produces a third motion that depends on their relationship. Mechanics can arrange gears so the output equals the average or the difference of the inputs. Link the inputs to the left and right wheels and use the output to drive a pointing device, and you have a heading indicator that needs no earth magnetism to work. The design requires careful thinking about gear ratios, tooth counts, and how to mount shafts so backlash and where do not ruin the calculation. That level of detail implies not only clever imagination but real workshops with skill in cutting gearing patterns and making reliable assemblies. Modern historians and engineers have built working reconstructions that make the principle obvious. Animated gear trains show how one wheel makes a gear turn clockwise while the other makes a matched gear turn counterclockwise. A central gear or carrier then records the difference and drives the pointer. Film reconstructions of a wooden chariot rolling down a track let viewers see the pointer stay steady as drivers steer across curves and switchbacks. Side-by-side comparisons with later differentials in clockwork and in vehicle drives make the technological family resemblance clear. Clockmakers learned to use related gear arrangements to average motions and to distribute power in the centuries that followed, and early vehicle differentials do a similar arithmetic on wheel speed. The implications are striking. If engineers in ancient China understood and built reliable differential gearing, then they had a grasp of gear arithmetic and of construction tolerances that rivaled later mechanical traditions. It suggests workshops that not only cast and hammered metal, but also designed multi-gear trains and anticipated wear and lubrication. It also raises practical questions. How common were such chariots? Were they showpieces for courts and military demonstration tools used only by elite engineers, or did a wider guild of mechanics deploy similar devices in surveying, in automata, and in other transport contexts? The archaeological silence en masse produced gear trains leaves room for both possibilities. Some reconstructions stress that the mechanism could be built from wood and simple bronze fittings, and so could vanish quickly from the record. Others argue that the social context of secrecy, prestige, and ritual display could have kept the knowledge tightly controlled until it faded. On screen, the south-pointing chariot becomes a hinge between myth and workshop. You can place a glossy lacquered model beside a worn bronze cog and feel the same mechanical logic at work. The mystery is not whether the idea is brilliant. It clearly is. The deeper question is whether it was an isolated flash of engineering brilliance, a curious toy that dazzled a court for a few generations, or a thread in a broader fabric of mechanical knowledge that for reasons of politics, economy, or accident unraveled and vanished. Which version explains a pointer that seemed to defy direction, and why did that understanding not leave more traces in the record a mechanical orchestra once played at a medieval court? Al-Jazari was the engineer behind that music. He lived in Diyarbakir in the 12th century, and he wrote a lavishly illustrated manual called the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. The book reads like a catalogue from a genius workshop. It shows water clocks that mark the hours with moving figures, a boat that carries a team of automated musicians, and a host of smaller automata that pour drinks, wash hands, and beat time in perfect rhythm. Each plate is drawn with the care of an inventor who expected others to copy his work. The devices are not fanciful illusions. They combine hydraulics with cams and with carefully timed valves and linkages. In plain terms, a cam is a shaped wheel that converts steady rotation into a jerky or periodic motion. Place a set of pins on a rotating drum and you have a primitive program. Turn the drum and the pins lift levers in a chosen sequence, much like the cylinder inside a music box. Al-Jazari used exactly that trick to program musical patterns. He also arranged floats and siphons so that water pressure and flow would trigger a sequence at the right moment, which is a clever form of regulation and timing long before modern clocks dominated Europe. One of his most famous creations is a water-driven castle clock that combined a display for hours, planetary indicators, and automata that emerged to mark the passing time. The same mind that drew decorative details also thought about maintenance, about how to drain or refill tanks, and about how to make mechanisms accessible to repair. That practical attention is part of what makes his work feel like the product of a living mechanical culture rather than the output of a single inspired craftsman. That raises the larger question that turns up again and again in histories of technology. Was Al-Jazari the peak of a deep and distributed tradition of automata makers in the medieval Islamic world? Or is his book a rare survivor that hints at a far larger landscape whose texts and workshops have been lost to time? He himself cites earlier engineers and builds on known hydraulic ideas that traveled across the eastern Mediterranean and into Baghdad centuries earlier. The Banu Musa brothers wrote about automata in a much earlier age, and Hellenistic sources on pneumatics and mechanics circulated in translation. Those prior currents suggest Al-Jazari did not appear out of nowhere. He was part of a long conversation about how water, air, and clever gearing could be harnessed to shape motion. At the same time, the documentary trail thins in strange places. Manuscripts burn, libraries disperse, and workshops dismantle when patrons fall or regimes change. Stone and metal sometimes survive, but wood, rope, and leather do not, and many of the devices Al-Jazari described used precisely those perishable elements. That combination makes a treatise even more precious. It preserves geometry, parts lists, and proportions that a lost workshop would otherwise have taken to the grave. The treatise reads like a workshop manual because perhaps it was one of the few manuals that escaped destruction. Visual evidence helps settle plausibility even if it cannot answer social questions. Modern reconstructions built from his drawings function exactly as his plates promise. A recreated boat with automated drummers will play a pattern when a hidden drum turns. A reconstructed water clock will trigger figures to pop out at appointed hours. Museums and experimental shops have demonstrated these machines in motion, and the effect is unmistakable. Seeing cams lift levers, watching a peg cylinder change the rhythm, and hearing a reconstructed automaton band play gives the sense that complex mechanical thinking was not only possible but practiced. So why did certain streams of that know-how wane in later centuries? Some of the reasons are practical. Political upheaval and invasions disrupted patronage networks and destroyed centers of manufacture. Economic shifts changed where resources flowed and what rulers chose to fund. The survival of knowledge also depends on institutional support such as guilds, schools, and copying scribes. If fewer apprentices learned a craft, or if written treatises were not widely copied, the embodied know-how shrank generation by generation. There are also cultural pivots to consider. As market demands shifted toward metallurgy for weaponry or toward different forms of urban consumption, the specialized crafts of temple automata and courtly spectacle could lose favor. Finally, materials matter. Iron and bronze scraps get melted down and redistributed while wooden gears rot away, so the physical record of an entire mechanical tradition can vanish while a single manuscript survives. On screen, the contrast is irresistible. A slow reveal of a manuscript page segues to an animated reconstruction of a cam drum, and then to a museum demo where a dozen moving figures perform in sequence. Those shots make clear that the logic of automation was present and sophisticated. The remaining puzzle is social and archival rather than technical. Did Al-Jazari embody a peak that never got institutionalized sufficiently to survive repeated centuries of turmoil? Or was he one brilliant node of a network of workshops that once hummed across cities and courts and faded when patronage and resources shifted? Which version fits the evidence, a lone towering genius preserved in ink, or a fragile but broad tradition whose middles we can no longer read because the pages that connected them did not survive the Tower of Babel? Reads like a complaint about ambition turned logistical nightmare. In Genesis, a single city and a single people decide to build a tower with its top in the heavens and a name to keep them united. A divine response scatters tongues and disperses labor, turning one coordinated project into many broken efforts. That image is literary and moral, but it sits on a landscape full of very human precedents. In Mesopotamia, temple towers called ziggurats rose in layered platforms of mudbrick and bitumen. The great platforms at Ur and the Temple Mound at Babylon called Etemenanki dominated cities and required years of planning, vast quantities of material and steady work by organized crews. When the biblical story points to hubris and fragmentation, it may also be remembering an era when people first learned how to marshal large resources in a single place and then feared what that power could do. Think about what a true monumental tower demands. Stone or brick by itself is only weight. To lift and set thousands of units, you need robust scaffolding and repetitive methods for moving loads safely. Builders develop standardized measurements so a wall lines up across a team. Quarrying and transport become predictable when someone writes down the size of a block, the length of a beam, and the number of workers needed to haul it. Those simple tools of coordination multiply human strength. Archaeological traces from the Near East show evidence of standardization and measurement in the way bricks were molded with uniform dimensions and in ruler marks on stone and clay. Those clues hint at shared templates and quality control, the mechanical equivalent of a recipe in a busy workshop. The harder part is not muscles but information. To feed and staff a project lasting months or years, you must count and allocate grain-managed teams and keep records of who worked when and for what wage. That is where the first administrative technologies come into play. In the centuries before and after the story that inspired Genesis, people used clay tokens and sealed clay envelopes called bulli to record quantities of grain, livestock, and labor. Those tokens evolved into the wedge-shaped cuneiform signs pressed on tablets, a switch from three-dimensional counters to written lists. Once you can write down allocations, you can plan a month ahead. Once you can stamp a seal on a tablet, you can authorize shipments across distance. Whole archives from cities like Uruk and Nippur preserve lists of rations, deliveries, labor rosters, and temple inventories. Those tablets are not poetry, they are spreadsheets of a pre-modern world. They are the silent organizing force behind every monumental wall. If the Tower of Babel is a myth about a failed human unity, then the archaeological analogs suggest what succeeded elsewhere. The ziggurat platforms required an administrative backbone that matched the labor. Temple economies pooled resources from agricultural hinterlands and from long-distance trade. Craftspeople worked on rotation with seasonal farmers. Specialist teams handled brickmaking, quarrying, and timber work. In some sites, stamps and official seals appear in repeated patterns, a hint that authorities controlled the flow of finished material and kept track of stockpiles. Even the logistics of moving mud brick require planning. Clay must be mixed, aged, dried, and fired or sun-baked in cycles that demand coordination across workshops and weeks of drying time. That kind of scheduling is a technology as much as a machine. Stories from Mesopotamia add texture. Sumerian and later Babylonian myths sometimes describe towers and stairways that bind earth and sky, and they place temple towers at the heart of civic life. Epic poems about kings who organize vast building campaigns read like administrative manuals in story form. The reasons for monumental building varied. Temples anchored economic life and served as storerooms and redistribution centers. A large platform was a visible lever of authority. Building it required techniques that are mundane and ingenious at once. Ramps, temporary harbors, sledges, and rafted transport shortened routes. Standard molds for bricks sped production. Ration lists and household tablets kept the workforce fed and accounted for. When those elements come together, they look like a vanished system of project management that a later storyteller might compress into a single moral tale about pride. Compare that to other traditions that remember large towers or walls. Across cultures, monuments often gather myths that explain who could command labor on a vast scale and why power concentrates in a place. Those stories rarely credit a single mechanical secret. They praise organization, ritual, and the capacity to hold people to a plan. That emphasis suggests something provocative about what a lost technology might mean. Instead of an exotic machine hidden underground, imagine a set of practical tools and social techniques that allowed distant fields, markets, and workshops to behave as a single, responsive organism. A set of clay tablets with ration lists and seal impressions, a set of standardized molds, a calendar keyed to harvests and corvée labor, and a chain of command that translated a plan into daily tasks. That is a technology of management. On screen, this reads beautifully. A CGI fly-through can climb layered mud brick platforms to reveal lines of scaffolding and workers hauling uniform bricks into place. Cut to high-resolution photos of cuneiform tablets and a clay envelope with tokens nested inside, and the viewer can see the invisible accounting that made the visible work possible. Comparative shots of ziggurats from different cities emphasize repeated planning principles rather than one miraculous technique. The contrast between a myth that blames language and the archaeological evidence that highlights record-keeping pulls the mystery in a new direction. Perhaps the true loss is not of a machine but of practices for organizing people and information at scale. Paper rarely survives the centuries like stone or clay, and oral command structures evaporate when communities disperse. A few tablets and a scatter of bricks remain, but the lived protocols of coordination, the forms and habits that let thousands act in unison, are fragile. The Tower of Babel may be telling us that the most powerful technologies are not gears and engines but rules for counting, naming, assigning, and recording. What happens when those rules disappear is exactly the kind of story that became a myth of confusion and dispersal. A wooden ark carrying every living thing sounds like a logistical manifesto as much as a miracle. If the Tower of Babel revealed ancient project management, flood tales reveal another kind of human mastery, the art of putting a lot of living weight on water and keeping it there. The Genesis account gives precise dimensions: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, and then walks through deck stalls and doorways. In Mesopotamia, the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh give their own construction lists and cargo instructions. Far away and centuries later, flood stories ripple through the Americas, the highlands of Mesoamerica, even into coastal myths where boats and rafts become the instruments of survival. The repetition matters. When so many cultures imagine a single vessel holding families, animals, and seed stock, they are not only telling moral tales, they are rehearsing a problem that demands real craft. Think like a shipwright for a minute and the questions multiply fast. How do you design a hull that will carry weight without capsizing? How do you arrange compartments so a broken plank does not flood the whole craft? How do you feed dozens of humans and hundreds of animals for weeks or months when fresh food rots and water sloshes? How do you keep air moving so animals do not suffocate? Those are engineering problems, not metaphors. Ancient seafaring cultures already had pieces of that puzzle. boat-building centers from the Nile to the eastern Mediterranean produced vessels of surprising scale. Egyptian depictions and the survival of a royal funerary barge carved and lashed from cedar planks show mastery of large hull joinery and caulking. Bronze Age shipwrecks like the Uluburun cargo and later classical wrecks show sophisticated carpentry joined with tar and pitch to seal seams. The Phoenicians and the people of the Aegean kept long-distance trade networks that demanded robust hulls, reliable keel construction, and the ability to stow diverse cargoes securely. Archaeological finds of massive keel timbers, keelsons, and frames reveal that timbers could be shaped and fitted in ways that have clear parallels with the needs of a big ark. On the technical side, naval architects wrestle with ratios. A very long, narrow hull behaves differently than a short, wide one. Stability comes from beam and ballast and from the way weight is distributed low in the hull. Ancient builders learned to lower the center of gravity by packing heavy cargo near the keel and by shaping bilges so waves pass with less heave. Compartmentalization is an elegant ancient trick. Subdividing a hull into watertight holds keeps a single breach from sinking the whole vessel. Evidence for bulkheads appears in archaeological timber fragments and in later texts describing ship repairs and damage control. Ventilation is another lived craft. Sailors created simple chimneys, hatches, and slatted decks to move air through crowded holds and to route smoke and humidity away from foodstuffs and bedding. That same attention shows up in folk solutions like cross-ventilation through paired hatches and in the placement of elevated platforms for animals to keep them drier and easier to clean. Provisioning for a voyage with mixed human and animal cargo intensifies the problem. Dry staples, grain, legumes, salted fish, and cured meat last longer than fresh fare, but animals need fodder and water. Storage strategies range from layered stowage of dried feed to small onboard cisterns for fresh water. Ancient mariners used pottery amphorae sealed with pitch for liquids and jars for preserved food. They rigged racks and tether points to keep animals from shifting weight at sea. Simple mechanical aids like capstans and windlasses reduce the force needed to haul heavy stores aboard and to secure cargo in rough weather. The idea of a multi-decked vessel with separate animal pens, feed rooms, and grain silos is old and practical rather than fanciful. Experimental archaeology brings these abstractions into motion. Reconstructions of reed boats and wooden hulls show that even primitive materials can cross oceans when built with knowledge of buoyancy, lashing, and layered structure. Thor Heyerdahl sailed the Kon-Tiki and later a reed raft called Ratu to test long-distance possibilities and to spotlight how traditional craft can achieve endurance. Replica Phoenician and Bronze Age ships built by modern shipwrights demonstrate how planked hulls caulked with organic pitch and sewn with cordage resist leaks and flex with waves. Those reconstructions reveal limits too. A vessel large enough to house many species for weeks needs careful maintenance, pumps or manual bailing systems, and a crew that understands constant adjustment. That human competence is a form of technology as much as any keel. Visually, there is rich storytelling to be done. Layered maps can trace the distribution of flood narratives across continents, while CGI reins an arc built from keel laying through deck framing and the fitting of stalls and ventilation shafts. Cross-sections can show how stowage for grain sits apart from pens for animals and how bilge channels lead to manual pumps. Footage of modern reconstructions hauling cargo and of boats being deliberately flooded and bailed gives a tactile sense of the work involved. Side-by-side shots comparing a cedar funerary barge, a Bronze Age wreck, and a reed raft make the technological conversation obvious. The ark begins to read less like a single miraculous object and more like a complex system of woodworking, animal handling, and provisioning practiced in many places. That raises the larger question that keeps archaeologists and storytellers talking. Do flood tales preserve technical memory of an age when building very large vessels was a common craft rather than a mythic exception? Could communities that faced seasonal inundation or shifting coasts have maintained shipwright guilds specialized in oversized craft that later became legendary when the practical need faded? Or are the stories cultural containers for moral and cosmological lessons that use familiar vessels as metaphors? The traces in wood, stone, and pottery give us clues, and the reconstructions give us plausible methods, but the space between myth and memory remains wide and inviting. Which side weighs heavier, the remembered craft or the crafted memory? Books and workshops can vanish overnight and take entire crafts with them. Think of Alexandria as less a single building and more a constellation of scholarship that took shape in the 3rd century before the Common Era and broadened over the next many centuries. Think of Nalanda rising as a teaching center from the 5th century into the early 13th century of the Common Era. Think of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad flourishing from the 9th century into the 13th century of the Common Era. Each of these places collected scrolls, schematics, mathematical treatises, medical notes, star tables, and engineering diagrams written in languages that a new regime might not bother to preserve. Those were not inert objects. They were tools for workshops, itinerant masters, and schoolrooms where hands learned as much as eyes read. Loss has many faces. War and sackings can scatter or burn libraries. Changing political priorities can starve a school of patrons and apprentices, so a chain of teaching simply stops. Climate and neglect rot organic materials like papyrus and parchment until only fragments remain. Economic collapse can interrupt trade in raw materials, and so a technique dependent on a particular metal or pigment becomes impractical to practice and then forgotten. Cultural shifts can make a script unreadable, so the manuals that remain become puzzles instead of instructions, and sometimes materials were deliberately erased and reused. Scribes scraped parchments to make new books. Those palimpsests are wounds and lifelines at once. The Archimedes palimpsest is the clearest example of how fragile transmission can be and how salvage can change our picture. A copy of lost mathematical treatises was overwritten by a later prayer book. Centuries of use hid the original under new ink but did not destroy it completely. In the 20th century and in the early 21st century, scholars used multispectral imaging to recover fragments of Archimedes' method of mechanical theorems and other works that had seemed gone. That recovery shows both loss and hope. Had the original parchment been burned in a conflagration rather than repurposed, those pages would have been gone for good. As it was, they survived in a palimpsest that required modern technology to decode. Other losses were less dramatic and more mundane. Workshops depend on apprenticeship. A smith learns by watching a master strike a hammer a certain way, by feeling the metal change under the blow, and by repeating an action until a reflex forms. A written recipe that lists ingredients and temperatures rarely captures that embodied skill. When a guild collapses or a patronage network dissolves, the recipes may remain, but the subtle hand motions and seasonal timing that produce consistent results evaporate. That is one reason why some metallurgical practices slipped out of living memory. The raw recipe alone did not convey the practiced judgments about ore selection, furnace behavior, and timing that turn a rough alloy into a reliable material. A few specific threads make the point sharply. The loss of certain Roman quarrying and finishing procedures left future masons guessing at how some faces were cut so tightly. Medieval glossaries sometimes preserve words for tools and steps, but without dynamic demonstration, those entries become cryptic lists rather than how-to manuals. The Byzantine secrecy around substances like Greek fire may have kept a weapon trade secret for generations, and then ensured that when social networks broke, the chemistry vanished with the keepers. The Lycurgus cup and the Antikythera mechanism show that sophistication existed in surprising forms. Their survival feels random because archives, workshop notes, and apprenticeship chains rarely survive the political and environmental shocks of history. On screen, these ideas translate into a simple visual logic. A slow-burning scroll collapsing into ash dramatizes sudden loss. A microscope view of a palimpsest under different light brings a ghost text back into being. Footage of modern craftsmen trying to reproduce an old recipe underscores how much of skill is hands and judgment, not words alone. Interviews with archivists and historians explain how continuity matters. One curator can keep a tradition alive by copying books teaching techniques and mentoring students. Remove that person and an entire line of practice can end within a generation. That leads to a sharper implication. When we call something a lost technology, are we always dealing with impossible ancient machines, or are we sometimes standing over the grave of interrupted transmission? How many lost technologies are simply the casualties of interrupted knowledge transmission rather than impossible inventions? Some legends point to machines and others point to people. We walked a trail that ends in surprising places. The Antikythera mechanism stands as clear mechanical evidence, an analog computer engraved in bronze that models the sky. Roman concrete revealed a chemistry that turns seawater into a healing agent, a material trick that explains why some harbors outlasted empires. Damascus steel and Wootz ingots trace a network of rare ores, crucible practice, and trade that produced blades with extraordinary microstructures. Göbekli Tepe taught us that organizational technology can be as transformative as any machine, a way of moving and coordinating people long before settled agriculture became the norm. Al-Jazari handed us drawings and parts lists that prove a sophisticated automata tradition flourished in courtly workshops. Those are the cases where myth plausibly masks real craft and technical practice waiting to be fully understood. Other stories bend more clearly toward metaphor and misreading. The small Quimbaya gold figures fit comfortably into ritual craft traditions, and the urge to see an airplane often tells us more about modern eyes than ancient makers. Atlantis reads most persuasively as a moral and political allegory wrapped in architectural detail rather than a single forgotten metropolis. The balanced takeaway is simple and stubborn. Myths are neither proof nor disproof. They are windows into cultural memory, clues that point scholars toward hypotheses worth testing, and traps if treated as evidence without context. When archaeology, experimental reconstruction, and careful philology meet a legend, the result is not instant certainty but disciplined curiosity that can reveal lost workflows, materials, know-how, and social practices. The most powerful discoveries in this tour were often not hidden engines but social ingenuity, craft processes, and organizational systems. A recipe handed down in a workshop, a coordinated workforce tied to seasonal rhythms, a set of administrative tablets with rations and assignments. Those are technologies too, and they explain as much about past brilliance as any gear or chemical formula. If you take away one thought, let it be this. The real thrill is not proving aliens or finding magic. The real thrill is recognizing that human problem solving in the past was wider and stranger than our simple narratives allow, and that sometimes the most astonishing technologies were invisible because they lived in people, in patterns of work, and in the quiet mastery of craft. Vote in the comments for the most convincing myth from the video and tell us which case you want a deeper episode about. For further reading, start with Tony Freeth and his team on the Antikythera mechanism, Marie D. Jackson on Roman pozzolanic materials, Alan Verhoeven and colleagues on Wootz and Damascus steel, Klaus Schmidt for Göbekli Tepe, and Donald R. Hill for Al-Jazari and his machine. Look for museum catalogs and peer-reviewed papers to follow threads into the original evidence. If you enjoyed the investigation like the video, subscribe to join future deep dives and ring the bell to be notified when a new mystery drops. Which legend from this journey will change the way you think about the human